Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show where we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And before we start, please let me say that if you enjoy these videos, don't forget to subscribe because I'm currently growing the channel and it would absolutely do me a massive favor. Now today we're going to be discussing one of my favorite Commander decks that I have. It is Yoshimaru Ever Faithful, and he has partner, of course, so I've partnered him with Rograkh, son of Rograkh. Why do I love this deck so much? It's because it's a deck where you can be super creative, you can play all these legendaries that you might not normally get to play, and go Boros Aggro legendary. Now a lot of people pair Yoshimaru with green and black. They pair him with the last of the Abzan commanders so you can kind of keep the counters around, but that's kind of like slow and dirtily, and I just thought I want to try something going really aggressive. So this is the result. The great thing about this deck as well is that I can constantly upgrade it, and I'm always on the lookout when new sets come out for very low mana cost legendaries in red and white that can slot right into this deck. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started. So we have Yoshimaru Ever Faithful to start off with. Whenever another legendary permanent enters the battlefield, he gets a +1/+1 counter on him. This includes lands, crucially, so we have a few legendary lands in there. And then Rograkh is perfect with him because on turn 1, you're pretty much guaranteed every game to have Yoshimaru as a 2/2 and Rograkh. You can get to play 2 things on turn 1, 2 legendaries, guaranteed every game. And that actually opens up the possibilities for a few other cards that we're going to discuss further on in the list. So the first creature we have is Adeline, Resplendent Cathart. Now she is really amazing in this deck because you're going to get a creature whenever you attack with anything. Since you're probably having Yoshimaru down early, he's going to be almost always attacking by turn 3 when she comes down, and that means you're going to get a bunch of 1/1 creature tokens. And since you're probably going to have Rograkh too, and he can attack another player who maybe doesn't have any blockers yet, you're almost always guaranteed to get at least 2 out of Adeline the turn she comes down. That's amazing. Next up we have Adriana, Captain of the God. Now she gives melee to all your creatures, so she is one of the top ends for this deck, and she is kind of the way we end up pushing through damage. We have a lot of attackers. They're all going to get really big if we attack multiple opponents, so we can potentially give +3/+3 to our entire team. Now that's really nice. Akiri Fearless Voyager is pretty good in the deck. We have a few equipments, not that many, but the entire deck isn't built around her, so it's fine if she works sometimes and other times not as much. And attaching equipments for one and giving Indestructible is really nice too. It can protect Yoshimaru, which we really don't want to die. And just being able to draw cards in Boros is pretty nice. We need some card advantage in this deck. She gives us that. Anafenza, Country Spirit, is a good 2-mana legend. She comes down turn 2 to keep pumping Yoshimaru. And then whenever any other creature comes in, she gives us more counters. So just very nice all around. Next we have Plague, Dean of Chaos, and Augusta, Dean of Order. We're normally going to be playing it as Augusta because it gives our creatures a little bit more offense and defense. We can kind of like adjust their stats depending on what we need for each circumstance. But if we don't have a turn 2 play and we want to pump Yoshimaru, having Plague on turn 2 isn't that bad either. Sometimes he's the better option as well late game when we want to start getting some cards. So yeah, these are both pretty good. Aurelia the War Leader. Now I know she's really expensive, but she is great in the deck. She just lets us have this whole extra attack phase to go nuts in. But if you can't afford her or you don't have Aurelia already, then here's another option that I would recommend, which is Carlac, Fury of Avernus. It's basically the same effect, just on a slightly less good body for the most part, but it's actually 1 mana cheaper as well, and it does give your whole team first strike. So in some ways it's better, and it's really cheap at the moment. It's like $2. This is a really underrated card. It's also a legendary, so we're not even losing out on that. I think you should definitely pick this up, and I might actually put this in the deck anyway because we probably want 2 copies of this effect. Next up we have Bruno Battlehammer, which is a sweet one. And each creature we control is going to get +2/+0 for each equipment attached to it. We have a few equipments, about 10 I think, so this is going to be on quite often, and then it just lets us move our equipments around once per turn. Just a nice little addition to the deck. Captain Lannery Storm is a nice aggressive creature, getting some treasure tokens, which means we can ramp a little bit, so that's really nice. And then occasionally when we sacrifice them, she's going to get a little bit bigger. Just basically sneaks in some damage early on small boards, and just a nice all-around card. Godo Bandit Warlord is really great for searching up equipments and getting them straight into play. You can get something really expensive. I will say that I'm not running Helm of the Host in this deck because I'm not a big fan personally of infinite combos, but if my meta gets more competitive I might include it, and you might want to too if your meta is a bit like that and you only can win through infinite combos. Next up we have Gorogoro, Disciple of Ryusei. Giving haste is a really good effect for 1 mana, so we really like that in this deck because a lot of our creatures can kind of be a bit clunky and slow if they don't get to attack immediately. And then the other ability is amazing. We're going to have modified creatures basically guaranteed because Yoshimaru always has counters on him. So late game we can just start pumping 5 mana into this each time and just making dragons. Grenzo Havoc Razor is really good in a deck like this where creatures sneak in a lot. You get to goad creatures, or you get to exile the top card of somebody's library and cast it. So you're going to be doing that a lot, seeing as you're going wide. And again, it's a 2 mana legendary. If you get this down on turn 2, you can really start ruining someone's day by playing cards from the top of their library. Then we have Heliod God of the Sun. Again, it's just a good creature. It's a legendary. It's going to make our board have vigilance, which is something we kind of want because we often get hit on the crackback. Yoshimaru is usually like really big, but if we attack with him then we get smashed back in response. But Heliod can stop that. He is going to let Yoshimaru stay back on defense and attack, which is really nice. And then if we have extra mana late game, we could just pump it into some tokens to keep going wide. Hopeful Initiate is almost always going to be great in this deck because we can just remove the counters from Yoshimaru, which we're always going to have access to destroy artifacts and enchantments. It's a really great card. It's also a nice aggro 1-drop. Icing Death. Now this is included because it basically gives us 2 legendaries for 1. When we first play it, we get the legendary dragon, and then when it dies, we get a legendary equipment that also makes our attacking easier. So being able to trigger Yoshimaru twice is really good. Iroas, God of Victory, is going to help our creatures get through. Normally it can be a bit difficult in the mid game, but when all your creatures have menace, then basically it's going to make it much harder for your opponent to block. And then even if they do block, we're not going to take damage from it, so this just makes combat basically impossible for our opponents. Here we have Isamaru, Hound of Konda. So this is just a vanilla 2/2 for 1, but he's a good boy. And he's basically the ancestor of Yoshimaru, so of course we had to include him in the deck. Obviously, you can upgrade him if you're trying to build for power, but thematically, it just seemed really cool to have him in there. Carry Zev is one of the best cards in the deck, surprisingly, and you may be wondering why. It's because the token she creates is legendary. So, what does that mean? Every turn when you attack, you're going to be triggering Yoshimaru again. Ragavan is destroying other formats, but in this deck, Carry Zev and the token Ragavan are the all-stars. Kedis, Emberclaw Familiar. This is a surprisingly good card in this deck because it triggers Yoshimaru again, and then also it's going to let us actually close out all opponents at the same time. However, it does put a big target on Yoshimaru because all opponents will then be trying to remove it, and not only the one you're attacking, so make sure you have a way to protect him before you go for this. Keleth just gives us more counters whenever Yoshimaru attacks. It also works really well with Rograkh because he doesn't have any power by himself, but once this is in play, he can start getting those counters and actually be quite a useful creature. Kytheon, Hero of Akros, is a pretty good one as well in this deck. It's going to trigger pretty easily because, well, think about it. If we have Rograkh and Yoshimaru out, that's already 2. We only need Kytheon himself, and that's 3. So it's very, very easy to trigger in this deck and to trigger him pretty early. And then once he becomes Gideon Battleforged, that's actually really good. It can make your combat a lot easier by forcing the opponents to attack with whatever blocker you don't want them to block with. Could also give your creature indestructible so it can attack into whatever it wants, or it can just swing in itself if you need to close out a game as a 4/4. So yeah, all around this card is really sweet in this deck and very easy to have active. This is a new addition that is incredibly good in this deck. Lizelle will let you get an extra counter every time you put a counter on something, and she's a legendary herself, so when she comes in, you're immediately going to get 2 counters on Yoshimaru, and then every other legendary that comes in is going to put 2 counters on Yoshimaru as well. So that's absolutely great in this deck, and it works particularly well with a card we're going to talk about later in the list. Mentor of the Meek is just a nice way to draw cards in white. Almost all the creatures in this deck meet the requirements, so yep. Mila, Crafty Companion. Well, it's another good boy kinda. I mean, it's a fox, not a dog. It just gives the opponent a little bit of a reason not to target our creatures, and if they do, we're going to end up drawing cards. They often have to remove Yoshimaru, so we're often going to be drawing cards off of this if they do remove it, which feels nice. We basically never play Luca, although I do suppose there might be some circumstances late game where he's better than Mila. Now this is the card that I was saying is really good with Lysel, and this is also one of the MVPs of the deck. Norin the Wary. If you're not familiar with this card, what happens with Norin is anytime anyone plays a spell, he exiles himself and returns at the end of turn. This happens during your turn and during your opponent's turn. He also exiles himself whenever he attacks. So you can basically never attack with this, never block with it, and never really do much of anything. But what he does do is trigger Yoshimaru every single time he comes in. And in a 4-player game, he's going to trigger Yoshimaru probably 4 times in a turn cycle. That is amazing, and if you have Lysel in play, that's 8 counters by the time the turn comes back to you. That is just incredible in this deck. Even in the worst case scenario without Lysel, he's growing Yoshimaru by +4/+4 pretty much every turn cycle. And you can't remove Norin, so even if they do remove Yoshimaru, you just put Yoshimaru back in, and then Norin starts the whole thing again. So yeah, this is a really, really good card in this deck. It's very difficult to remove. Next up we have Odric Blood Cursed. This is a bad card that people complained a lot when it got revealed because people love Odric and this version just didn't seem very good. However, in this deck, it's not as bad as it looks. We have a lot of keywords running around, and we also have access to 3 of them on Rograkh in the command zone. So once Odric is guaranteed to make 3 blood tokens, he starts to become a lot less bad. Blood tokens are actually quite good. The problem is usually with Odric, you're not guaranteed them. In this deck, you are. We also have Odric Lunar Marshal in this deck, and he's also going to grant our whole board keywords. Again, with Rograkh, we're guaranteed to give our board First Strike, Trample, and Menace. That is a pretty good cocktail of abilities, particularly on Yoshimaru. We also often have other keywords lying around, so this is a very good card in the deck. Professional Facebreaker is a relatively new addition to the deck. This is a good card in any aggro deck in Commander. It has Menace, which also makes it really difficult to block. But yeah, the fact that we're going to be getting at least 1 to 2 treasure tokens every turn means that this is going to be really good. And then it just gives us card advantage if we don't need the treasure tokens for mana, which we often want in this deck. Just really sweet. Subira Tulzidi Caravana just makes all of our stuff very difficult to block. And in the late game, we can draw a ton of cards with her if we need to. Sun Titan is just good recursion and good value, nothing much to say here. Tajik Legion's Edge is going to protect us against certain effects such as Blasphemous Act and the like. This is quite good. Mentor is also nice. It's just a nice aggressive creature. Tesha, Ancestor's Apostle, is really good in this deck, as you can imagine. Because the vast majority of the deck is legendary and artifacts, we're going to be returning stuff like crazy, and also most of our creatures have a mana value of 3 or less. This is the perfect deck for Tesha. Talia, Heretic Cathart, helps us push some damage through by slowing down the opponent's defenses and their mana. Tuk-Tuk the Explorer is another really good one in the deck because he's a legendary when he comes in, and the token he makes is also legendary. So it's triggering Yoshimaru twice, and we're also getting a 5/5 out of it, which is not bad at all. Welcoming Vampire is going to draw us a lot of cards in the deck. That's really nice. Of course, being able to refuel is necessary when you're playing such an aggro deck. Zergo Bellstriker. Now this one may not look like much, but it's particularly good in this deck because the dash ability lets us recast it. So you can keep doing this every turn if you want to give Yoshimaru more and more counters, or you could just dash it once and then play it for real and give him 2 counters and be done with it. But if you have the mana and you can keep recasting it, it just triggers Yoshimaru over and over. And we're moving into Enchantments. Day of Destiny gives all your legendaries +2/+2. Not much to be said. Fighter class is nice because we get to pick up equipments and then we get to equip them for cheaper. The final mode is very good because we can force the opponent to block us with their utility creatures and get rid of them that way. Now we have a few backgrounds as well because they're all legendary. Guild Artisan is really good. If you're just attacking the player with the most life, you're going to get 2 tokens. Because we have Rograkh and Yoshimaru, we can send them both in and get 4 treasure tokens. That's amazing. Legion's Landing is just a nice 1 mana legendary, and then because we have Rograkh and Yoshimaru from the command zone, it should be easy to transform, and once it does, it's just gonna make some more tokens for us to go wide with. Path of Metal is a sweet one that you don't really see in many decks because of the requirement of attacking with 2 creatures that have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, and or Haste. In this deck it's a lot easier because by having access to Rograkh we already have half of that. We just need 1 more, and a lot of the creatures in this deck have that. So this is very easy to transform. Once it does, Metali is a nice way to close out games or to destroy creatures that attack you at random. It just gives a little bit of extra value. Tavern Brawler is another background, which means it's going to trigger Yoshimaru, and then it's going to give us some card advantage and actually make our commanders more aggressive. It works particularly well with Rograkh because it can sometimes boost his power by a fair bit, and then that makes him actually be able to attack, which is nice. Next up we have Veteran Soldier. It's basically the same thing, asking us to attack the player with the highest life total, and when we do, we get a 1/1 token. This is obviously great. We're going to get 2 of them if we attack with Yoshimaru and Rograkh. Wedding Announcement is one of my pet cards and goes in most of my decks. This is going to draw us cards if we attack with 2 creatures, which again we're always going to be doing. If not, we're going to keep going wide, and then eventually it's going to flip and give our whole board +1/+1, which is amazing. Avernus Memorial is sweet in this deck. It's the most expensive card in the deck by a lot, and it's going to make like 90% of our deck indestructible, which is awesome. But it costs only a fraction of the price of what Avernus costs. And then we have Blackblade Reforged. Equip creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. Okay, that's going to be pretty decent. And equip legendary creature 3. That's crucial because the deck is mostly legendaries. Eater of Virtue is a 1-mana legendary to trigger Yoshimaru, and then if a creature dies while this is on it, it's going to get all those keywords put on. So it's very easy for this to pick up some keywords, but even if it doesn't, it's +2/+0 for 1. You can't really go wrong with that. Hammer of Perforos is just a nice one to give all of our creatures haste. It's also legendary, and in the late game we can start making 3/3 tokens to close out games. Hero's Podium is going to give massive buffs to our whole team. It's going to make Rograkh sweet and let him attack through a lot of boards, and then we're going to be able to find legendary creatures fairly easy with the X ability. If we do X 3 or 4, we're pretty likely to hit, and at that point we're just getting some card advantage, which is nice. Mox Amber is amazing for this deck. I know it's really expensive, but if you have one or if you can manage to pick one up for cheap, it's a perfect fit for this deck because it's basically just a Mox that adds red or white in this deck. Having access to Yoshimaru and Rograkh on turn 1 means that this is just an extra land that you can play on turn 1 if you draw it. It's really, really strong. Skull Clamp is just Skull Clamp. It's going to let us draw cards. Not much to see here. One of the best cards in Commander. Fear of Heliod is going to buff our board and also pump Yoshimaru. And then occasionally you're going to be able to kill off some stuff. Swift Up Boots. Not much to say again. Just protection for Yoshimaru. Sword of the Animist. Whenever you attack, you're going to get to look for a land. But crucially, it's also legendary. So that's really, really nice. Tenza. Godo's Maul. This is a spicy one. The creature's going to get +1/+1. And then if it's legendary, it's going to get another +2/+2. Hello, Rograkh and Yoshimaru. And then if it's red, it has Trample. I mean, that's not super relevant unless you're putting it on another legendary, but still, this card just gives a lot of stats. The equip cost is cheap, so love to see it. The Ozolith is another expensive one, but really useful if you have it. It's a 1-mana legendary that triggers Yoshimaru, and then when Yoshimaru does die, they're going to have to deal with the Ozolith, or you're going to be able to keep those counters and put them back on him when you recast him, or put them on just anything else. Weatherlight is nice for digging for historic cards. Most of our deck is legendaries and artifacts, so we're very likely to hit. Whisper Silk Cloak I ended up adding recently because Yoshimaru sometimes has trouble closing out games. This helps him get through and gives him protection. Boros Charm is just a little bit of protection for our team. We're basically only ever using the indestructible mode, although Double Strike can occasionally be really good on Yoshimaru if they neglect to block. Generous Gift is just removal. Same with Path to Exile. Wear and Tear. Urza's Ruinous Blast is a board wipe that doesn't generally affect our board. We also basically always meet the legendary sorcery requirement, so that's good. And then we move on to lands. We're just going to quickly mention some lands that are legendary. Eiganjo is a nice utility land. It's also a legendary land. Gaia Reach, Sanitarium, and Mikokoro help us not run out of gas, and they're also legendary, which you might not have known. Inventor's Fair is also legendary, and late game it can actually... Inventor's Fair is also legendary. It's usually going to gain us 1 life each turn as well, and late game we can trade it in to look for an artifact card, so that's really nice. Kirkeep is a staple in many a red deck, particularly aggressive red decks, and in this deck being legendary is also upside, so yeah, that's nice. Mobilized District is amazing in this deck because it's going to be able to activate for free, so we get a free 3/3 creature with vigilance until end of turn, and because it has vigilance we can use it to block in each opponent's turn too. So Kenzen is a nice one for making a couple of spirits. I didn't mention it with Eiganjo, but the cost reduction is also really good in this deck. They're both basically just going to cost 1 red or 1 white. Castle Embereth is not legendary, but it does pump our whole team, so that's just a nice little bit of utility and extra damage to have. Oof, that has been a long one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I've given you some ideas for brewing your own Yoshimaru decks. It's one of my favorite, although it is very aggressive, so make sure you're okay with being the enemy from the beginning of the game. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment in the comment section below. I read and respond to all of them. You can also click like and or subscribe to support the channel. It really helps me. And until next time, take care.